George Galloway. He's been sworn in today. He is now officially the Rochdale MP. He's in Parliament. It wasn't David Davis, as had previously been suggested, and it wasn't Jeremy Corbyn who escorted him in. But no matter what you think of Galloway and what you think of his rhetoric and his politics, he is a popular figure. He's a great orator, and he has gotten... We've been saying for the last few years, people have an apathy towards politics in this country now, but he has managed to go to Rochdale and churn it up and get support.
Yeah, I think what happened in Rochdale was a rejection of the establishment.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of talk about Labour's lead in the polls, but what people tend to ignore is that Keir Starmer is still a deeply unpopular politician,
Correct.
Almost as unpopular as Rishi Sunak. So the fact that these... I mean, he is right when he uses his now famous phrase, two cheeks of the same backside. I think that is playing into the sentiment that voters understand.
Mm-hmm.
He's used the issue of Gaza very effectively to drive a wedge into the voting bases, both Labour and Tory. It looks like Rochdale came about as a result of effective collapse in the Labour vote, principally around Gaza. And, you know, I don't agree with a lot of what George Galloway says, but it's hard to resist the conclusion that he's an effective orator, at least.
Yeah.
And I think he does speak to a certain kind of parliamentarian that doesn't really exist anymore. He's certainly not a technocrat. Mm-hmm. He's not someone who, you know, obsesses. We can talk about Jeremy Hunt and the budget, but when, you know, you have these kinds of levels of discussion around the economy, which is like, well, should we cut 12p off national insurance or should we cut 1% off corporation tax? The idea that someone comes in with at least some passion and some ideas about the big issues, I think, you know, voters appreciate that. I do think there are some very... I mean, I don't agree with a word George Galloway says when it comes to the situation in Gaza. And I think, actually, some of the alliances he's made in the course of his political career could, in due course, become quite dangerous. Yeah. But I think George Galloway is also right when he talks about Rishi Sunak's speech. You know, Rishi Sunak coming out on the steps of Downing Street and saying that George Galloway's victory is a victory for extremism and division. Well, George Galloway's right to say that he won the vote.
Yeah.
So there is something you have to do about that. You have to recognise that democratically he has won the people of Rochdale over. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to convince them otherwise, you need to take that kind of anti-establishment sentiment and I think channel it into someone more inspiring and exciting than George Galloway.
Well, do you think we could see a replication of this in a general election?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I think Rochdale is a specific case, mm-hmm. and I think George Galloway was a specific politician for that particular case and was effective in that scenario. The question is now whether the Workers' Party can replicate their victories elsewhere. I mean, the one thing to say about this election is that it could be the election of non-establishment parties, so outside the two-party system. So we've seen relatively significant victories for Reform. We've seen Reform taking votes from the Conservative Party.
They've taken votes, they haven't won anything.
They haven't won anything, but they do have the power to be influential in whether or not the Tories maintain existing seats.
True, but they are doing worse. Reform are doing worse currently than UKIP were doing in similar seats.
So that's all true. And so that raises big questions about whether a party like the Workers' Party is going to create any kind of impact in the context of a general election, where necessarily the issues are wider, where necessarily, you know, a politician like George Galloway could not run on a single issue elsewhere in the country necessarily in the same way that he could in Rochdale.
Yeah.
But actually, I think it should be welcomed. I do think the public are crying out for an alternative to this two-party system. Absolutely. They are crying out for something new. They are crying out for big ideas. Pretty consistently, when you look at polling, you know, none of the above tends to be the winning vote.
Yeah.
And if a party came along who could genuinely harness the energy behind that none of the above sentiment, then maybe we could see some significant change.
Wasn't that Jeremy Corbyn a few years ago?
Clearly not.